got you. Giving the news, I got a bad case of loving you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Yoder, editorial director of Calkins Creek Books, and I am very excited to be talking with Gail Jarrow today, author of White House Secrets, a book about how U.S. presidents kept their illnesses secret with the help of others and the consequences that ensued. This is the fourth book in Gail's Medical Fiascoes series, and just like the others, as thrilling. So let's begin. Gail, did you know when you began the research for the book just how relevant this subject would be?
Well, I was doing the research and writing during the Biden administration. And like a majority of people, according to polls, I noticed that there were issues with his health. But I didn't feel as if I had enough information, substantial information, to write a whole chapter as I was doing for these other presidents. So you and I talked, and I asked you to give me a little extension on my manuscript due date till the election, because I really felt something was going to happen. Something was going to come out. There'd be a lot more information that I could work with. And lo and behold, there was. In June of 2024, the debate happened, and then subsequently, Biden dropped out of the presidential race. And as soon as that happened, really the floodgates opened, and there was so much information. People that were in a position to know that there'd been some secrets kept came forward. There was a lot more reporting, not that there hadn't been before, but a lot of reporters suddenly became interested and started digging. So I had enough information, and I found myself going from writing and doing research based on history to doing research based on current events.
Yeah. So how did you really decide on the other presidents to, feature in the book?
Well, this is, as you said, the fourth book of my Medical Fiascoes series. When we have a president who is sick or in any way unable to perform up to his top abilities, that's really a fiasco for the country and for the world. So I felt this subject really fit into the Medical Fiasco series. To decide which presidents I would do, I read a lot of books about presidents and their medical histories and narrowed it down. I only wanted to do presidents who had covered up their health problem, and I didn't want to deal with anything that was a rumor. I wanted to only deal with well-documented cases. So that helped me narrow it down. Once I did narrow it down to the 9 presidents, I read autobiographies, memoirs of people who had been close to the president, newspapers. In some cases, I actually saw the medical records. They were available. So I put it all together in order to write about each president.
Did the apparent Biden cover-up, going back to Biden, have any parallels to these other presidents?
They did, yes. There's a common denominator in all 9 presidents. 3 common denominators. First of all, there was a medical problem. There was something either short or long term that was a health problem for the president. And the president and people around him decided, number 2, to keep it a secret and to concoct a cover-up. And then the third common thing was that when anybody got suspicious and asked questions, there was denial. There's no problem, nothing to see here. And the people asking the question were often criticized, condemned, vilified. So that was absolutely something I saw across all these 9 presidents. Now, one president that really embodied parallels was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was the 28th president. He was elected in 1912. He served 8 years. In 1919, toward the beginning of his second term, he had a massive stroke. He was paralyzed on his left side. He, at least temporarily, had some mental incapacitation. And his wife, his doctor, and his secretary, and the secretary is really the chief of staff in those days, conspired to keep it a secret. They didn't tell the vice president. They didn't tell the Secretary of State, who at that time was next in line after the vice president, even though particularly the Secretary of State was asking a lot of questions. No, Wilson, he's sick, but nothing serious. And in fact, he was not capable of doing his job. This went on really for a long time. He didn't have a cabinet meeting until 6 months afterward. And at that time, cabinet members later said he was really out of it. During this period, his wife did all the conversations with anybody that wanted to see Wilson. She met them separately and said, I'll take what you're saying to the president. And then she'd come back and say, this is what he said. There were people in Congress that didn't think that Wilson had actually signed some important documents. They thought his wife had. Now we're hearing about the auto pen. So there's another parallel. Ultimately, Wilson did not run again, but he wanted to. He wanted to run in 1920, but the leaders of the Democratic Party said, they knew there was a problem. And in those days, there were no primaries, so they could kind of fix things. And he did not run again. A second kind of interesting case was Chester Arthur. He was the 21st president, and he became president in 1881 when James Garfield was assassinated. In his first year, Arthur found out that he had a chronic kidney disease that was going to kill him. Didn't tell anybody. It did have effect on him because it made him fatigued. He would have episodes of pain, swelling, but he denied that there were any problems. Anytime the press asked, people around him said, there's nothing here. There's no problem. He's perfectly healthy. And in fact, he was not perfectly healthy, and he did die less than 2 years after he left office. One person that I find really interesting was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was the 22nd and 24th president, the only one other than Donald Trump who had 2 separate terms interrupted by another president. He was elected first in 1884 and then in 1892. In 1893, he'd only been in his second term a few months, discovered that he had oral cancer. Well, this was definitely a secret they didn't want anybody to know about, because in those days, there wasn't much you could do. But he had a doctor who said, we should cut it out. We should do surgery. Well, can't do that in a hospital because the secret would be out. So they came up with this plan that Cleveland would get on a yacht owned by one of his friends, say he was going fishing, and that the yacht was going to take him up to his summer home in Cape Cod. Well, his doctor assembled a crack team of surgeons. Cleveland got on this yacht. They did the surgery on a yacht. And you can imagine 1893, the condition of doing that. It wasn't an operating room.
Yeah, hope the water wasn't rough.
Yeah. The surgery was all done inside his mouth, so there were no scars. He had facial hair, wasn't upset at all. And afterward, there was a prosthesis put into the upper part of his mouth. People couldn't see this a few months later. They couldn't tell anything had happened, and he didn't sound funny. He went up to his summer home, and he really stayed there the whole summer. And during that period, there were questions. Where is he? We haven't seen him. Again, his vice president was never told this was happening, never told there was surgery. I mean, he could have died easily. He was not, he was very heavy. not a candidate for surgery, but they got away with it. But a month later, there was an investigative reporter who got a hint of this and wrote an article and went public about the surgery. And he talked to an eyewitness who was a dentist who was present. Even though the surgeons were all sworn to secrecy, this guy let it out. Well, Cleveland's people immediately turned on this investigative reporter. They had their friendly newspapers vilify the reporter, and they killed the story, basically. 24 years later, the story came out because one of the surgeons who was there, Cleveland was dead now, came out and said that everything that reporter had said was true, and that's what happened. But it took 24 years.
Wow. Huh. Did doctors, sort of lie about any other presidents besides those three that you mentioned?
They often did, sometimes understandably because, doctor-patient confidentiality. But some of these doctors blatantly lied, and they had different motives. So James Garfield, 20th president, elected in 1880, shot in 1881. He would not have died from the bullet because as we now know, there was an autopsy and it was not in a place that would have caused his death, didn't do any damage. However, his doctor, who had been a Civil War surgeon, wasn't really up on all the latest rules about the human body. And that was that you do not put an unsterile finger or instrument into someone's body. And he did. And they didn't know where the bullet was, so they're probing for it. They introduced bacteria, and that's what ultimately killed Garfield 80 days later. Throughout the 80 days, there were press releases saying this is what's going on with Garfield, and the public was informed, but the doctor involved was really too rosy in what he said. And up until Garfield's death, clearly he was going to die. He had his body disintegrated. The guy is still saying everything's fine, he's going to recover. So, it was a blatant lie and probably done to protect his own reputation. Another person like that, another doctor like that, was Warren Harding's doctor. Harding was the 29th president, elected in 1920. He was not in good shape. This doctor that he had brought from his Ohio hometown. The guy was really not qualified. And it turned out that Harding had a lot of problems with his cardiovascular system, very high blood pressure. And this guy just really wasn't doing anything about it or even acknowledging it. Harding went on a cross-country trip in 1923 by train. And when he got to the West Coast, he started to have real problems. And he ended up in San Francisco in a hotel, and he was suffering. This doctor went out and said, he has food poisoning. That's all that's wrong. Well, there were other doctors that were brought in when he was in San Francisco because there were some cabinet members that were savvy, and they called in some Stanford cardiologists. And these guys, the minute they saw Harding, they knew. And the doctor, the hometown doctor, continued to say food poisoning. Harding died. At the time, they thought it was a stroke, but medical historians think it was really a heart attack when they look at the symptoms. Franklin Roosevelt. He had a doctor who was a military doctor, Navy doctor, and the guy continued to say during Roosevelt's third term, that he's fine. There's nothing wrong with him. But people looked at him and could see he wasn't fine. His daughter insisted that a cardiologist be brought in. The cardiologist saw that he wasn't fine, recommended that Roosevelt take it easy. Well, it's the middle of World War II, and it was pretty hard for him to take it easy. He recommended that he stop smoking. Roosevelt smoked quite a lot. He cut down, but he didn't stop. Roosevelt wanted to run for a fourth term in 1944, and he pushed to do that. And this doctor kept saying, he's fine. He can be president another 4 years. No problem. That sounds familiar.
Yes.
But the Democratic Party at the time could see there's something wrong with this guy. He's not going to make it 4 more years. They made sure that the vice president was somebody the party could work with, and they picked Harry Truman. And it was just a few months after FDR took his fourth oath of office that he did drop dead, and he had a stroke. Mm. And then Kennedy was one whose doctor really blatantly lied. Kennedy had Addison's disease, which is the adrenal gland doesn't work properly and doesn't release hormones that are critical to survival. He also had a very bad back. One doctor diagnosed that one leg was shorter than the other, and he had to wear lifts in the short leg. None of this fit the image that Kennedy had, which was youthful, athletic, healthy, virile, all that. He was probably one of our sickest presidents. When this came out, that there might be a problem, anytime there was a hint of that, his doctor denied it, would release a statement saying, no, he doesn't have Addison's disease. Kennedy himself, when asked point blank by an aide, said, I don't have Addison's disease. And he did. He was taking amphetamines and painkillers while he was in the White House. All of this came out later, of course. People didn't know.
So doctors were involved in cover-ups. Let's talk a little bit about the media being involved, because that seems to be in the news today, very relevant. So talk a little bit about that. I think people would be interested, and it sort of ties into the relevancy.
Well, as I mentioned with Grover Cleveland, there were reporters that were asking questions, and he had friends that were running newspapers that liked Cleveland, and they made sure that these stories were kept quiet, and they criticized anybody that said anything. So that's a dishonest press, in my opinion. FDR, Roosevelt had polio. He caught it when he was 39. Now, people do get over polio without problems. He did not. His legs were paralyzed. He could not support his weight. But he went to great lengths to show that he did not have polio. There was this narrative, well, I had it, but I got better. He had to use a wheelchair. And the White House did not want any reporting about that. And they didn't want any photographs taken of him in a wheelchair. I think on the slide we have a part of the book, a spread from the book that shows FDR in a wheelchair. The one photograph that has a child in it was taken by a cousin, and that came out long after Roosevelt was gone. But the other two were taken on the sly. If a Secret Service saw somebody taking a photograph, they would take the camera. Reporters knew that if they reported on this, and they knew that they would lose access to Roosevelt. So they didn't want that. Roosevelt often brought reporters into his office and gave out tidbits that would get them headlines. So they didn't want to say anything. And then Kennedy, there were magazine articles, newspaper articles that said how healthy he was and all these glowing things about his health. And they were being fed to the press by his doctors and his press secretary and people close to him. And they went along with it. And there were enough hints that there was a problem, but it didn't get reported.
So I know you take years and months combined to do the research, but in the research and in the writing, was there anything that surprised you while you were writing your book, and what you think readers might be surprised by?
My big surprise had to do with Ronald Reagan, because I lived through it.
And there he is.
And there he is. This was when moments before he was shot in Washington. Now, there were after the shooting, there were 3 people who were shot and fell to the ground. They heard, as soon as he heard the shot, the guy in the beige coat behind him is a Secret Service agent. He pushed Reagan into the waiting limo and told the driver to speed to the White House because they didn't know what was going on. Could have been a conspiracy. So Reagan was uncomfortable, and he said to the agent, "Could you get off me? You're hurting me." And as soon as Reagan sat up, he coughed up blood. The agent said to the driver, "Forget the White House, we're going to the hospital." So they went to a trauma center. Always about optics, Reagan got out of the limo on his own and walked into the ER and collapsed. So it turned out that the bullet that went into him was in his lungs, and it came within an inch of his heart, and he lost like half his blood. The surgeon in the ER and the surgeon that worked on him felt that 15 minutes more, he would have been dead. So the Secret Service agent saved his life by making that quick decision to go to a hospital.
And I love the quote that the doctor said, or Reagan said to him, and the doctor replied. Maybe you can share that.
"Oh, I hope you're all Republicans." And the doctor, who was not a Republican, said, "Today we are all Republicans."
I love that. I love that.
It was pretty tricky surgery, but they saved him. And like 13 hours later, his aides brought a bill to the hospital for Reagan to sign. Not an important bill. Again, optics, they wanted to communicate that he was still in charge. He was fine. And I believe that.
Yeah.
So a lot of this didn't come out till later. And I didn't think it was, I mean, the people that wrote about it later, the aides said they did it because it was in the middle of the Cold War. They didn't want our enemies to think that, he was completely out of commission. So anyway, that was a big surprise.
And what do you think readers will be surprised by? And this will be our last question because we have some questions from the audience.
Okay. Briefly, I'll say that I think teens will find everything a surprise because I don't think they would know any of this. And a lot of adults that I've talked to about what I'm doing, they don't know anything about it either. And it's not surprising because this stuff was under the radar. Some of it took years to come out. So a lot of it is little known history.
That's true. Okay, well, let's go. Let's see what kind of questions we have. Let's see, I'm going to go to the question and answer. There was one, I thought, but I don't see it here in the question and answer.
It's in the chat, Carolyn.
Okay, sorry. Hold on, sorry about this. It says, the question, clearly you are passionate about this topic. What's coming up next? Which was going to be my question, but anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, talk about how the research for White House secrets actually led to your next book.
When I did this research, I came up with a whole bunch of presidents who had health issues. And some writers were saying, oh, these were cover-ups. But when I did deeper research into each of these people, I found out that they were not cover-ups. But they were serious illnesses. I was going to put it into an appendix of White House secrets, but there were so many interesting stories that I thought would be great to elaborate. And we talked about it, and I suggested a follow-up book called The President is Ailing. And that will cover several presidents who have had serious illnesses, took them out of commission for a long period. They weren't covering it up. They were transparent about it, but they were serious illnesses and deserve a story told.
Good. So that will be the fifth book in the Medical Fiasco series, and we have here all of your books. You know, you specialize in combining science and history, and maybe talk about in the last few minutes how you began that journey, why you began that journey, and why you're passionate about providing young readers with accurate and thrilling history.
Well, in college, I majored in zoology, so I have a background in bio. I took all the pre-med courses, although I didn't intend to become a doctor, but I have this background that allows me to read a lot of these medical journals and medical reports, and I can understand what I'm looking at. I taught middle school for several years. So I'm very interested in education and what kids find out about the world and when they learn it. And I think some of this, all of it that I'm writing about, I think it is important. I think knowing your history is very important because you can learn from it and because there are parallels, as we talked about today, to the present. And then the other aspect of it is that I just have always loved history. Just, I like to read about it. I didn't study it formally, I didn't major in it, but it was just something I loved. So writing all these books allows me to combine my experience in education and my interest in history and my background in the biological sciences.
Yeah, and it's my pleasure to work on, I think, all of them with you.
Yes.
It's been a great journey, but we do have another question. Most of the people are, loving what you write and hope you continue on and on. So that's great news. And one woman says she hopes she wins one of your books. So that will be, or one of the books. So that's great. Somebody asked if you cover McKinley's assassination and the failure to use X-rays to find the bullet in White House secrets.
Okay, well, McKinley is the president is ailing. So that answers that.
Okay.
The X-ray issue really, and in White House Secrets, I talk about this, comparing James Garfield and Ronald Reagan, 100 years apart in their assassination attempt. Mm-hmm. Reagan, they used X-rays. They needed X-rays to find out where this bullet was. In Garfield's case, they didn't have X-rays, so they're probing around looking for the bullet, which they couldn't find. Not to mention all the other aspects of medicine that changed. But really, when you do a history study, you find out how technology, the medical technology, has made such a difference. Mm-hmm. Reagan was much more seriously injured than James Garfield. And he walked out of a hospital within 2 weeks. So that's medicine for you.
Yeah. Who are some of the presidents that you haven't talked about in the webinar? I think we have about a minute. I don't know if there's somebody that you've forgotten to bring up that's in the book.
In White House Secrets?
Yeah.
I think I've hit all 9 of them.
Okay.
But in the next book, I'm going to be talking about other presidents. 2, I'll mention George Washington. George Washington, just months after he became president, developed an infection on his thigh. And it was an infection that could be fatal. In fact, one of the people that worked for him at Mount Vernon had died from the exact same condition. They didn't have antibiotics, and he had a high fever, and he very well could have died. But a surgeon had the guts to cut into this infection, boil, and drain it. And it took 3 months for George Washington to recover fully. Another president that will be covered more recently was Dwight Eisenhower. While he was president, he had a heart attack, a stroke, and major intestinal surgery. But he was very upfront about it, and he was he was conscious of what happened with Woodrow Wilson. and he did not want a repeat of that. So he put out the word, we're going to be honest and come forth with all the information, which he did.
Great. Well, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you today and to learn more about White House secrets and the upcoming What's Ailing the President. So farewell, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, doctor, give me the news. I got a bad case of loving